Well, in a few minutes' time, someone will make a speech at the Liberal Democrat conference in which they are expected to warn that capitalism kills competition, good companies are destroyed by short-term investors looking for a killing, and murky corporate practices threaten the economy. Under normal circumstances, a speech like that in front of Liberal Democrat activists wouldn't make much of an impact. But these are not normal circumstances. The man doing the speech-making is Vince Cable, and he also happens to be the business secretary. It's anticipated that Mr. Cable will tell party delegates in Liverpool the following: markets are often irrational or rigged, so I am shining a harsh light into the murky world of corporate behaviour. Why should good companies be destroyed by short-term investors looking for a speculative killing while their accomplices in the city make fat fees? Why do directors forget their wider duties when a fat cheque is waved before them? Capitalism takes no prisoners and kills competition where it can. As you might imagine, that's created something of a storm amongst business types. Vince Cable's been accused of Marxism. He insists his rhetoric is not an outbreak of Marxism, but whether he is a devotee of Das Kapital or not, is the business secretary's analysis of capitalism correct? We're joined by John Rees, author who's on the editorial board of the online magazine Counterfire, who I can describe as a Marxist, I think.
You can.
Thank you. Lord Digby Jones, not a Marxist, a businessman, former trade minister, ex-director general of the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry. Good afternoon to you in Cambridge.
Yeah, good afternoon, and certainly not a Marxist.
And Digby, you were taking aim, I heard, at Vince Cable this morning, saying that you can't behave like this. You're the business secretary now.
Well, yes, you see, we live in a free world, and he is quite entitled to those views. I agree with a little bit of it. I think people who own Cadbury shares in New York for something like 42 or 48 hours and then could sell to the highest bidder, and there is a company that was absolutely not what Vince Cable is accusing them of, I think was wrong, and there must be rules to stop that, in my view. So he's not completely wrong. The problem I have with him is he is in cabinet to champion business. He has to win the confidence of the business community. There are small businessmen and women all over Britain busting a gut and have really run good quality businesses. And they will listen to this and say, Vince, if you want to say this sort of thing, no problem at all. That's what a Liberal conference, Jeremy, as you said, that's what a Liberal conference is about. You can let your hair down, be in opposition, have a good old moan. It's what they've done for 50 years. You can't do it if you're a Minister of the Crown and you're there to champion business around the world, not just in Britain. And does some of the banking community, have they behaved deplorably? Yes. Do we need better and better enforced regulation? Yes. But to say words like, the murky aspects of the boardroom and business, what's that going to do for a kid? We need good quality people coming into the business community so that we create the profit, so that we generate the tax, so that we employ the people to get Britain out of this mess.
John Rees, what do you make of that?
Well, the problem is Vince Cable has only hinted at what millions of people in bus queues and pubs and council estates all over this country are saying, and that is that something is fundamentally wrong with the system, which periodically pitches us into mass unemployment, is now going to produce a situation where welfare services are going to be cut by 25 to 40%. There is something fundamentally at root wrong with this system. That's the point that Mark said. That's the point that Vince Cable is at least gesturing towards.
Although, what do you think is wrong with it then?
That if you have uncontrolled competition, then inevitably the deciding factor about what happens in society is what makes a profit. Now, certain very important things in this society, like education, like universal health care, like looking after people when they're old or unemployed, aren't amenable to the profit system.
So who pays for them?
What should happen is that through general taxation, people are provided...
Who generates the tax?
Well, hang on a minute.
Well, just explain who generates the tax.
Well, I'm a member of the NUJ, and in the NUJ, we like people who are members of the NUJ to do the interviewing, not other guests.
No, so if you just
let me finish...
Ask me the question. Who generates the tax?
The working people generate the tax.
Well,
they generate the profit. What happens in this society is that people who work all their working lives for 48 hours a week don't earn the kind of money.
Just a minute.
They're
employed by a business, yes? They're employed by a business.
They're employed by the rich, and it's their work that makes the rich rich.
What generates the job and what generates the tax? It is the profit made by business.
What generates the needs of working people that are supplied by working people doing the jobs, and to whom the rich then come and say, this crisis has been caused
Digby,
by our system, and you're going to pay for it.
Digby,
and that's wrong.
We hear where you're coming from, Digby. Most people don't understand what you're saying. same. But in the last 3 years, we have seen that whole drive for profit completely upended, haven't we, by the banking crisis. We've understood that if you allow a bunch of clever people to pursue their own ends, they will bring down the country.
So, well, may I say that you're getting
not so clever people.
You're getting three confused messages. Firstly, people who are listening to this programme in the public sector worried about their jobs, that's got nothing whatsoever to do with the irresponsible behaviour of bankers who caused that problem. That's to do, just a minute, that's to do with a nation that has borrowed
with public
its credit card.
With public
hang on.
It's to do with a nation that's maxed out its credit card. And their second message, where you're absolutely right, is irresponsible people who have run banks without control. Do they need reining in? Do we need a different regulated system? You bet we do, and I'm completely in agreement with you.
Well, then what's wrong with Vince Cable saying that then?
Well, because he hasn't once mentioned the word banks in this. He's talked about business generally. That's what's wrong with it, because there's an awful lot of good quality businessmen and women in this country who, frankly, without them, you wouldn't get a job, you wouldn't get any taxation, and you wouldn't be able to pay for your public services. And for the Cabinet member who's responsible for business to put them into the same pot as irresponsible bankers is frankly a disgrace.
John Rees.
Well, actually, it's not just the bankers. This crisis is at least as much to do with the housing market and the way in which people were deregulated in the housing market and the subprime market in the United States as it was to do with the bankers. The banking system generalised the crisis, but the crisis actually started in other parts of the economy as well.
John, you're complaining about the human heart here, aren't you, basically? Because the housing crisis is created by people borrowing too much for houses they couldn't in the end afford. And
absolutely.
But you're complaining about human nature.
No. What I'm complaining about is the fact that situation, the demand driven into the private housing market, was created by the abolition of council housing under the Tories, by the inability of the Labour government to rebuild public housing, in which case all the demand by people who couldn't afford it was forced into a situation where they were taken advantage of by the housing institutions.
You're marching valiantly towards yesterday, aren't you?
No, actually,
you're actually on the page of yesterday.
No, you're actually one step behind the Tory government. Even they are saying that there should have been more public housing than there was. We've been saying it for 15 or 20 years
I'm
now.
an apolitical peer. I don't support any party. What I'm trying to do is ensure that business can trade Britain out of this mess, and you won't pull that off if you actually have a Minister of the Crown putting every single business into this pot of opacity, which is frankly unfair.
Okay. No, Digby, there's just one more for you. You've isolated the banks, and obviously they are a special case, and there's been much ruminating about them. But let's just take another business, one of the biggest, if not the biggest in the States in the last 10 years, Enron. You've seen the play, you've seen the film, you've read the book. Unbelievable story of what happens when, again, the smartest people in the room are allowed to do their own thing. Now, what is wrong with Vince Cable shining a light on that?
Nothing whatsoever. And there's nothing wrong with being in a country where you have rules that properly enforced would have stopped that happening. I've got nothing but...
Because that was a disgrace, wasn't it?
Of course it was, and I want to support him in doing that. The problem is, he is saying in his speech that business... The whole of business is like this. And that actually is just so utterly damaging for the way that we're going to get people employed, the way we're going to generate... The only people on earth who generate tax that can pay for public services in this country is business, because you either reward the shareholders who pay tax on it, you keep it in the business and you pay tax on it, or you employ people and they pay tax on it. And if it's not for the profit business makes, you don't get any tax in Britain, and therefore you don't get any public services. And it's no good sitting here saying, well, yes, that's awful, what about the workers? The workers are people, just like you and me, who want to actually participate in making more money for themselves. They are motivated by money, just like the people who are the shareholders, just like everybody else. The people who actually maxed out on their mortgages in that dreadful time of 2 or 3 years ago, they're not blameless, you know. They were also driven by a financial motive.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why people
put more money
yesterday,
into John.
One of the reasons why people borrowed more money in the last 20 years than they would have done otherwise is because wages were held down, welfare was being cut back, things that would have been provided by the welfare state were transferred into the private sector, and people who couldn't get decent wages started using their credit cards and started using their mortgages as a way of compensating for that.
Would you abolish the private sector?
No, what I would do is I would put working people in control of their own lives.
Bob Crow? Bob Crow in charge?
Well, I'll tell you one thing about Bob Crow's members. At least they've managed to maintain their living standards, and at least they're not the people who crashed the entire economy like the people in the banks
John,
and like the people in the
one last question
sector.
for you, John Rees, which is this. Somewhere in, let us say, India, right? There's a guy who runs a company. He wants to expand, incredibly, into this country. So he wants to actually have a little outpost in this country because the pound is low and it's going to help him trade, and he's excited about it. He reads Vince Cable's speech and he thinks, uh-oh, I don't like the sound of that. That's the business secretary saying he's going to shine a light into murky corporate practices, and in the blink of an eye, he's changed his plans to France. Would you regret that?
If somebody who wants to come here and flout the law or pay below...
he doesn't want to flout the law. He just doesn't like the atmosphere.
Well, the murky practices, let's define what we mean. Murky practices, in my mind...
Just answer the question.
I am answering the question to the person who asked it.
Do you think that is a good thing, that a man in Bangalore won't come and invest in Britain because of what he hears today? Is that a good or a bad thing?
If he wants to come here and engage in murky business practices and the business secretary has told him that won't wash in this country, good. Yeah. And I hope that unions in France make exactly the same case, and unions in India make exactly the same case, and then perhaps we'll get rid of poverty wages.
Thank you both very much indeed. Fascinating. John Rees, Marxist author on the editorial board of the online magazine Counterfire, and Lord Digby Jones, businessman. And this is Aha on Radio 2. Jeremy Vine here. Good afternoon.